it shows that the Europeans have not woken up to realize that the era in which European governments could pass judgments on other countries is over. I think it's very important to make a distinction between two separate questions. One is whether or not China will be peaceful. And the next question is whether China will be benevolent. Right? These are two completely separate questions. Now, I believe that the phrase benevolent great power is an oxymoron. There's no such thing as a benevolent great power. All great powers, and this has only been true for 2,000 years, will put their own interests first and everybody else's interests second. And so when any small country deals with a great power, the small country will be very naive if it believes that the great power will sacrifice its interests for the small state. But the question as to whether or not China will be peaceful is a completely different question. And here the answer is actually given in the opening pages of Henry Kissinger's book on China. And as you know, he begins the book with a long discussion of Sun Tzu. And Sun Tzu, the great Chinese strategist, believed that the worst way to win a war is to win it by fighting. And the best way to win a war is to win it without fighting. So there's no question that China will seek to expand its influence and its impact on the region and the world. But the Chinese can also believe that the stupidest thing they could do is to emulate the United States and start fighting a new war every few years. And this is Kissinger's book, I must emphasize. Kissinger says the Chinese believe that it's the height of stupidity to keep fighting wars, when if you can achieve what you want to achieve without having to fight wars. And the Chinese certainly have emerged as a great power. And by the way, out of the 193 countries in the world, the vast majority of the countries in the global south now accept China as more or less an equal power to the United States. And the Chinese have achieved this without fighting a single war. And so that's the remarkable thing about the Chinese. So I have no doubt that China will try to expand its reach and influence, because that's what all great powers do. But they believe it would be stupid to do so by starting or fighting wars.
And you don't see this as a potential problem if China seeks to expand its influence in Southeast Asia, claiming more of the South China Seas, influence across the Taiwan Straits? You don't see that as an effort to make the Asian century the Chinese century?
Well, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned Southeast Asia, because Southeast Asia actually has lived with China for 2,000 years. And out of the 10 states in Southeast Asia, 9 have an Indic base. Indian culture has had a far greater impact on Southeast Asia than China has had. So Southeast Asia is used to living with many powers as its neighbors. So Chinese influence will grow in Southeast Asia. There's absolutely no question. I mean, again, to give you a simple example, in the year 2000, trade between ASEAN and China was only $40 billion in the year 2000. By 2022, it had hit $975 billion, almost $1 trillion. It was the world's largest trading relationship. Surely with so much trade, Chinese influence is going to grow, obviously. But at the same time, Southeast Asia is also very good at hedging its bets. And so the United States, for example, has now invested more in Southeast Asia than it has in China, Japan, South Korea, India combined. Now that shows a geopolitical shrewdness of the Southeast Asians, that is completely underestimated by simple-minded Westerners who see the world in black and white terms and don't understand that in Asia, the name of the game is nuance. And don't try to put people into categories. You're either pro-Chinese or anti-Chinese or pro-American or anti-American. No. The Southeast Asians will protect their interests and have developed wisdom over the ages of how to handle their interests. I'll give you one example. The one country that understands China better than any other country, I believe, is Vietnam. Now, they've had a relationship for 2,000 years. And Vietnam, by the way, was occupied by China only for 1,000 years. And the Vietnamese have a saying that to become the leader of Vietnam, you must be able to stand up to China. And you must be able to get along with China. If you cannot do both, you cannot be a leader of Vietnam. So that's what the Southeast Asians are doing. They will get along with China, but from time to time, they'll quietly stand up to China if they believe that their interests are being affected. So, but of course, we don't have to do this publicly. We don't have to necessarily make a big song and dance about it. But at the end of the day, you look at how much progress Southeast Asia has made. And to give you another shocking statistic, in the decade 2010 to 2020, the 10 ASEAN countries, their combined GNP is 1/5 that of the European Union. But ASEAN added more to global economic growth in the decade 2010 to 2020 than the European Union did. I mean, there's some remarkable things that are happening in Asia that go unrecognized in the West.
So, as a simple-minded Westerner, allow me to present to you the second half of what a challenge to your position in the interest of lively conversation, and this would relate to China's policies internally, which again some liken to internal colonialism. You said in Has China Won that China has never really been expansionist, which is news to the people of Tibet and Xinjiang and Mongolia over its history. In this new memoir, you say that the statement China has carried out a genocide in Xinjiang is, quote, factually incorrect, which you could certainly argue semantically. But you deflect immediately to a sort of whataboutism argument with America's role in leading to the Cambodian genocide. And I, as a reader, I sort of felt that you weren't really engaging with the human rights accusations, the human rights criticisms of China, which is so common in the West. Crimes against humanity is the UN's own term for what's happening in Xinjiang, or the high level of dissent against the CCP, whether in Hong Kong or on the mainland. So how can we take your arguments in good faith if you sometimes I feel dismiss these facts as a sort of Western not getting China?
Well, I mean, when you mentioned the case of Tibet, as you know, the boundaries of all contemporary states today are set by the realities of the 20th century, right? And these boundaries, as you know, were accepted by the United Nations when the PRC became a member of the UN. No one challenged those boundaries. In fact, even when it was represented by the nationalist government for many years, even though they only physically control all of Taiwan, the maps of China showed Tibet. And I think, so if you want to say, well, Tibet should be returned to the Tibetans, do you want to go back and say that Texas and California should be returned to the Mexicans? I mean, so the question is,
about sovereignty. We're not talking about issues of sovereignty. No one is questioning that Hong Kong is part of China.
No. But many people question it. There are people, as you know, in the West.
My question is about internal policies and human rights abuses. Those criticisms.
Okay. Yes. Well, I would say that at the end of the day, China has got to decide what kind of political system is going to have, and it's got to find its own balance. And clearly, the Chinese believe that they are better off with strong central control. And the history of China shows that when the central government becomes weak, the country becomes divided, chaos emerges, and many Chinese people die. And there are far greater deprivations of human rights that take place when the center is weak. And, Chinese, as you know, experienced that very recently in their century of humiliation from 1842 to 1949. And the Chinese also, and this I hope you will acknowledge as a fact, found that when they were weak, they were trampled on by the Western powers. And as at the end of the 20th century, the British and French looted and pillaged the Summer Palace like the Taliban, So, I mean, these are historical facts you cannot take away. So when a Westerner comes to China and says, hey, why don't you loosen up? And, it's okay, allow dissent, allow these things, it's okay if you have a bit of chaos. Don't worry, we won't take advantage of you. The Chinese should be very stupid to trust the West. Absolutely stupid after what happened to them from 1842 to 1949.
How would them loosening up their internal policies allow them to be taken advantage of?
Well, I mean, if you do have chaos in China, if once again the center becomes weak, and great powers do take advantage of divisions, and so I think the point at the end of the day, the most important statistic that every Westerner should know is that the West makes up 12% of the world's population in a small global village that we live in. The rest makes up 88%. The rest have been quite passive for the last 200 years of Western domination of world history, but the rest are waking up now. And these countries will find their own ways and means of adjusting to the modern world, their own systems and so on and so forth. And I think we in Southeast Asia believe that we cannot advise the Chinese on what is the best form of government for them. It's for them to decide. But it's also not up to the Chinese to tell us what our system of government should be. We choose our own form of government, you choose your own form of government, and we'll live with each other. And the same is true of India too, by the way. I mean, India also is going to choose its own balance of freedom and authority in many of these areas. And all societies are struggling to find the right balance. And I think even in the West, there will be, I believe, a move away from emphasizing too much individual freedoms towards emphasizing some degree of need for national cohesion in addition to having individual freedoms. But again, every society has got to make that decision for themselves. And certainly, apart from the West, you notice that most countries in the global South don't go around lecturing other countries on what is good or what is bad for them.
Lecturing certainly is bad, but surely we all have the right to talk about it openly and criticize, just as we criticize our own government.
Well, certainly. I mean, as individuals, you can criticize, but I think it is unwise for European governments, for example, to go and lecture the Chinese government on what is good or what is bad for them. It shows that the Europeans have not woken up to realize that the era in which European governments could pass judgments on other countries is over. We are making a fundamental turn in history now. Fundamental turn. And the European governments don't seem to realize that the world will no longer accept lectures from European governments at a time when the Europeans have shown their absolute geopolitical incompetence in failing to prevent a war from taking place at their borders. At the end of the day, I believe, you should make this an axiom, peace, like in peace in Asia, reflects geopolitical competence. We find ways and means of dealing with problems in such a way that we avoid wars. Wars reflect geopolitical incompetence. And the Europeans created all these wonderful institutions like OSCE and all that, but couldn't prevent a war. So I think here, this is a time when it'd be good for Western minds to show a certain degree of humility in talking to the rest of the world, instead of telling the rest of the world, we know better than you what is good for you. Please don't do that anymore.
偷偷告诉大家，我最近发现了新法宝 Royal Face 逆时奇迹系列，它有活肤露、全效精华，还有精华霜。尤其我皮肤比较偏干，所以我非常的注重保湿。保湿做得好，肌肤自然烹饪。提亮肤色更年轻，抚平皱纹超有感，而且气色变好。用心保养，每天都更美一点。美吧。